Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00. I've been rather erratic with my uploads recently, and I apologise for that. I've been ill and a little demotivated just because of how hard I've been working on all fronts of my life. It was going to catch up to me at some point, but rest assured, content is lined up and coming thick and fast. But you're not here to listen to me bitch and whine about my problems, you're here for some Halo content, so let's get to it. This is my Law and Theories video series, and today we're doing an in-depth analysis of Chief's Geas. I've looked at it before, but the Chief's evolution that was bestowed upon him by the librarian during the events of Halo 4 are of particular interest to me. There is precious little information available about exactly what the librarian did to him, so let's do a little digging, see if we can't bring some information to light. The first thing we will look at is the footage that plays during the conversation between Chief and the librarian, during which time I believe the librarian is already making alterations to Chief's biology. Why do I think this? Well, the place Chief actually meets the librarian is not the place he was in moments before. Look, here we see Chief is on a Forerunner bridge stretching out from a larger structure, stood before a large monument in an area surrounded by cloud. Yet right before this, the Chief enters a large, fully enclosed room with a powerful energy beam emitting from the floor directly ahead of him, which then rapidly pulls him towards it, saturating his vision to near complete whiteout. That energy beam is a kind of stasis field that also houses a neurally active array. The Chief was pulled within and forced into stasis in a similar manner as to how Dr. Halsey was during Spartan Ops. This stasis kept his body somewhat immobilized, while his mind was accessed by the Forerunner systems, allowing the librarian to talk directly to John. Everything, including Chief's surroundings during this process, is simply a fabrication, possibly his own mind trying to make sense of the sensory input it was receiving, but more likely to be simply a simulated reality constructed by the librarian to keep Chief comfortable, controlled, and focused. I believe, or rather I know, this is the case, as the room he enters and the position he is pulled to is exactly the same room he is dropped back into after his encounter. As you can see from here, from the threshold of the room, the beam is emitting from a circular structure on the floor. There are two raised platforms either side of it, and a slope down to a lower level, which is exactly where we find Chief afterward, stood in an energy beam on a circular structure on the floor, between two raised platforms, and a slope down to a lower level. He never left that room. Chief was held in stasis while the librarian performed the necessary adjustments to his biology with or without his permission, and all the while the librarian interfaced with him directly, telling him of the history of the didact to justify the alterations to Chief, even though she was already performing them. She knew if he was told about the didact that he would accept the alterations, no questions asked. Well, only one question asked.
Can I defeat the didact without it?
No.
Then do it.
Prepare.
All the footage from here is best to look at it as a figurative representation or a metaphor of what is happening within the Chief, because everything you see is not really there. It is within the Chief's subconscious while he is being held in stasis. Now, the process Chief was undergoing is called a mutation. It is part of Forerunner-controlled evolutionary biology. Mutation was a Forerunner term referring to customized biological maturation to new forms or rates, entailing a carefully adjusted combination of genetic engineering, gene therapy, and biochemical manipulation. A Forerunner's mutation determined the individual's place within their family, maniple, guild, or society overall. Typically, a mutation was a slow, gradual process, with the changes appearing over a period of several years. There is a much faster process called a brevet mutation. These were typically performed by warrior servants during wartime, and the effects began showing nearly instantly, with others taking effect days, months, and up to a few years later. A brevet mutation was performed by the Didact on the Forerunner born Stella Makes Eternal Lasting, who then became the Isodidact. After the full effects of his brevet mutation took place, he appeared nearly as an identical clone to the original Didact, that is before the Didact mutated himself beyond recognition, but we will get to him later. This brevet mutation is the mutation that I believe Chief underwent due to the near-instant implementation of an immunity to the Composer, and the other genetic gifts he was given gradually in the coming days. Now to the actual mutation itself. The first images we see are structures that resemble neurons of the brain. The first steps of a mutation are that the individual's body is deep scanned. This process is likely what is taking place at this stage. His mind is still active, even though his body has been held in stasis. The next image we see is the Chief stood before a powerful light, with his body and armour being gradually disintegrated. This could be a representation of the effects of the Composer at this stage, but I believe it more likely to represent his biology being broken down and remodelled. It is likely, for the Chief's cellular biology at least, that the stasis field has effectively put his entire biology into a time-locked state, the most complete and perpetual freezing of all biological processes, and the halting of the passage of time. This is likely required due to the immense biological alterations about to take place, in the same way computer updates happen in a single larger update that have to be installed, taking control generally away from the user as it happens, rather than thousands of tiny little changes more likely to cause severe problems. Chief's biology has been paused, so this new update can be implemented into his genome with as minimal of a negative effect as possible. We get a few more flickered images of neurons when we suddenly get an image of what appears to be a dark fluid or chemical diffusing gradually. Mutation also requires various chemicals involved in mutation. It is worth noting that the chemicals were delivered by small spherules that outlined and scanned the bodies of both the individual being mutated as well as their mentor that they were to image after, usually but not always apparent. We'll come back to this later too. After a few more repeated images, we get a dark fluid rolling nearly intelligently over what appears to be a dark metallic surface. I believe what we're seeing here is actually the mutative chemical rolling across the surface of Chief's armour. The fluid seems to move in a way that suggests it's probably either contains a Forerunner equivalent to nanomachines, or is likely a smart material or programmable matter that will penetrate through his armour and begin the biological changes he is destined for. Although it's lacking any colour, most of these sequences of images that we've seen so far are also lacking in colour, likely due to the bleaching effect caused by the intense light and energy stasis field Chief is currently held within. Next, we see what appears to be the fragmented sections of Chief's body being pulled through a tunnel-like portal. Again, we see the fluid forming what we can only describe as a structural shape of sorts, reinforcing the concept that the fluid is a programmable matter and thus integral to the mutation. After a few more repeated images, we get a very brief look at an ancient human in their armour. I believe this image is more than just the librarian showing Chief the events of the distant past. It has already been explained that humans can have the Geas of their ancestors implanted within them, and depending on the pitch and cadence of the Geas, the implanted personality can exist simply as a voice in the host's mind, or take full control of the host's body, allowing the two to coexist and share knowledge and memories. For a life worker like the librarian, she can even implement these Geas to be expressed at very specific time spans. This may indicate that the ancient human we see here is actually a previous life, so to speak. The Chief's ancient ancestor lived and fought at that time, was captured and composed, and used as the personality seed for the Chief himself. This has some pretty huge implications if correct, but right now it's simply a theory based on what we have observed. Finally, the image resolves into a battle, an ancient battle between humans and Forerunners. This, again, is more than it appears, as I believe what we are seeing here are memories. Leading from the previous theory that Chief has lived before during the time of ancient humanity through his implanted ancestor's Geas, these memories could likely be from his ancestor and thus be a life that Chief has, directly or indirectly, lived himself. I know it's getting a bit esoteric, but stick with me. This theory gets more traction in the next change of images where we see what appears to be digitized humans screaming out in agony. This, again, could be the memories of Chief's ancestor Geas as he was composed and broken down into digital form, creating what the Forerunners call an essence. These essences were stored in massive systems in a kind of stasis until they are needed to be used. Again, these images of essences floating in a void seem to speak to this theory once again. Here we see the programmable matter once again, and now the chemical has become more diffuse within another medium, likely the deepest tissues of the Chief. Then we see them begin to take form, reconstructing DNA base pairs and thus implementing the genetic alterations that the librarian intends. Remember, it is best to look at this footage as figurative representations or metaphors of what is currently taking place within the Chief. So next we see what I believe to be yet another memory, but in this one we can see what appears to be halo rings and a group of individuals stood together. But this memory does not belong to Chief's ancestor Geas. This one belongs to the isodidact. The isodidact then appears to be stood inside a device as it closes around him. The isodidact was the one who activated the array and thus one of the last Forerunners known to be alive before the firing of the Halo array. In this scene, what I believe we are seeing is the librarian's perspective of the isodidact converting himself into an essence. This was likely right before she indexed his essence and began sowing the seeds for creation to ensure that he would reach the desired point in time within the desired individual. The images we see following this show the librarian's hand also being broken down into an essence. You can even see a few instances of her face crying out in agony. This is how the librarian converted herself into an essence so that she could survive the ages and be there for the isodidact when he needed her. But how would that work if she knew both he and she were converted to essences? Well, we're getting to that. A few flickering images of a human, or perhaps Forerunner egg, appear, chased by images of a fetus. These are figurative and indicate a new birth, or life being seeded once again. Then we see a blue ring of energy that then fills with a greenish haze, which eventually forms into the shape of an iris of an eye, which then dilates and blinks. I think what we're seeing is actually Chief's eye, as his biology is being changed and the chemicals coursing throughout his body begin taking effect, even down to the structure of his eyes. A few more images of the programmable matter appear, when the image of the egg is replaced by what looks like a star. More images of programmable matter, and the star is eclipsed by a large planetoid. This indicates that the mutation is nearing its completion and Chief's mind is struggling under the immense load it is being put under, the eclipse representing darkness overcoming him. You can see during the images, which appear to be in a field with overgrown grass, that there is a stormy sky raging above it. This may even be a throwback to the field that Chief was once led in with a fellow Spartan 2 candidate discussing life elsewhere in the universe, and the storms now raging above it, indicating his internal struggle. Finally, we see what is nearly undoubtedly a cryptum, a large spherical object containing the Urdidact in Halo 4 and Blue Team in Halo 5. The cryptum settles down and a device lowers from its belly, and within it stands the isodidact. This is a metaphor and representative that the isodidact has awoken from his slumber, as that is what cryptons are intended for, and thus has finally arrived in his fullness within the chief's mind. If you haven't heard the theory, allow me to enlighten you. There is a long-standing theory that Chief carries the Geas of the isodidact. This is demonstrated in Halo Combat Evolved when 343 Guilty Spark seems to recognize the Chief and references a conversation they never had during the level 2 betrayals.
You already knew that. I mean, how couldn't you?
Left out that little detail, did he?
We have followed outbreak containment procedure to the letter. You were with me each step of the way as we managed this crisis.
Chief, I'm picking up movement.
Why would you hesitate to do what you've already done?
We need to go right now.
Last time you asked me, if it were my choice, would I do it? Having had considerable time to ponder this matter, my answer has not changed. There is no choice. We must activate the ring.
It is now understood that 343 wasn't talking to Chief, but to the dormant isodidact within him. 343 recognized the Chief as the isodidact. He even confirms it in the terminals that he must ascertain the pitch and cadence of his Geas before granting full access to Installation 04's systems. So it's very well established that Chief carries the Geas of the isodidact. After these images, it finally resolves back to Chief on that bridge with the librarian, which again we know to be a mental fabrication. After this, Chief is released from stasis, is surrounded by dissipating energy stasis barriers, falls to a knee, and is finally released. And so begins the gradual revelations of what changes were made. That is what we saw during Halo 4. As the librarian unlocked his genetic gifts, she gave him an immunity to the composer, yes, but also she unlocked his ancestral Geas and the Geas of the isodidact, which she specifically planted and planned Chief's physical evolution, his armor, and Cortana to all culminate at the same time. Chief's existence in his current form is no accident, and has been designed over 1,000 lifetimes in advance. Later in Halo 4, Chief begins to be able to hear the didact, but Cortana cannot hear the voices. She can't detect any incoming signals, but does admit that the Chief's vitals are all over the place. This is because the voice he is hearing is the Geas of the isodidact speaking to him from within his own mind, rather than the didact speaking to him via communication channels or telepathically. In Halo 5, Chief is able to interface with the domain, a feat no human has been capable of for at least 100,000 years or more. It cripples him to the floor for the first time, but he manages it nonetheless. He has always looked at Forerunner devices and just known how to and where to operate it, like it's tantalizingly familiar to him. So far, we have a fairly decent amount of information about the Chief's Geas and what exactly it could enable him to do in the short term, but in the longer term, that's anyone's guess. I'd like to see this explored much more comprehensively in game, and come to a storied reason as to why they started down this path of narrative in the first place, but while we wait for that, this analysis of the Chief's Geas will have to do. The second I know more, you'll know more. Thanks for watching. Stick your comments down below, and I look forward to what you have to say. If you're new to the channel and like lore theories and Halo technology being analysed at insane levels of detail, hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon so next time I put a video out, you're told the second it hits the shelves. Also, if you really like the channel, consider popping over to Patreon and give whatever support you can over there. It massively helps me out and frees up more time for me to put into this Halo content and other Halo related projects. Thanks again everyone. Now go rest your brain.